I think like in the Boeing case, I think the big problem was the CEO was an accountant. Like, I mean, nothing against accountants, but like, what do they know about building airplanes? I mean, this is like, I think it's important that the person running the organization understands the core thing that the company does.
You would never cut it as a Harvard Business School professor with an attitude like that.
Yeah, exactly. They're just making widgets.
Welcome back, everybody. We are here for round 2 of our podcast on the topic of building startups and companies in the post-COVID world. Last time we got through 5 out of 25 of the excellent questions that people submitted, so we'll see if we can get through at least 5 more this time. Let's dive right into the deep end, which is startups. And so we talked a lot about the sort of general post-COVID world last time. Now we're going to start talking specifically about startups. So Lars Schmidt asks, how should companies think differently about organizational design and talent deployment as they now have more ways to address core business needs? And then he puts in parentheses, full-time employees, freelancers, gig workers, outsourcing, and now the rise of AI. And also put this again in the post-COVID world where companies also have now a lot more geographic flexibility about where to put different operations. So I interpret the question as there's a whole bunch of new options or previous options that are becoming more viable now. And let's start with startups. How should startups think differently about sort of configuring how they think about their employee business?
Yeah, so I'd say it's important to kind of think about first sort of the old reasons why you would have somebody kind of in the company versus outsourced. And it really, like, probably the biggest reason is knowledge. So if you think about a job like data entry, where not much, it doesn't matter the knowledge of the last data you entered to do the next data, then that's a really good outsourced opportunity because you don't have to retain the knowledge. So you can, kind of buy the service as you need it, as opposed to kind of have it permanently. The opposite of that would be something like a software architect who designed your whole product, and then that person leaves, then, that's going to be a very big setback because you're going to have to reconstruct whatever they knew. And this kind of gets into it that historically, companies have been pretty bad at kind of retaining knowledge systematically. So like there's what's in your people's heads, and then there's what's in your systems, and the kind of former is much bigger than the latter in terms of just a total body of knowledge. And look, it's very hard to, have a great company if you can't learn from the past, if you don't kind of move forward. If you think about it, we had a really interesting conversation with Adam D'Angelo years ago. I don't know if you remember, Mark, where he was saying like one of the keys to Facebook at the time's growth team was that they had not just that they had a growth team, but they had the exact same people on it for years and years and years. And the reason was the work they were doing was fairly alchemistic in nature. And, they try a few things, see if that worked, try a different thing. And if you didn't remember all those experiments, then you'd just be doomed to repeat failed experiments. And that's kind of like, I think, the key to why you'd want somebody kind of as an employee. The other reason why is just the agency problem. So, should we have an outsourced attorney who has just as much, kind of love for the company on the other side of the transaction as they do for us, or they're optimizing for something different than the long-term good of the company? That would be kind of the other reason to have somebody inside. So then how does that change now? Well, a big change is AI. So you go, a couple of things. One, can you outsource it to AI? Like, can AI actually do the job? But also, can AI just remember what you did? And then can you query that knowledge base in a better way than you could, say, Salesforce, right? Like, so you have these old systems that we call them often write-only databases because information goes in, but it never comes out. With AI, does that equation kind of change? And now you have some jobs where Well, previously you would have had to definitely retain the people, but now if you just plug them into the system, even if the human is doing the work, the system remembers what they did, and somebody new can come in and quickly kind of figure out whether what they're doing makes sense or not. So, that would be probably a big change. In terms of international, I think that's, with kind of remote work being more effective, that, we've seen the huge pickup in kind of people just deploying people internationally for not just cost reasons, but also just that's where the talent's available. So it used to be, when we started, you wouldn't even have an engineering group in another city, right? Like you had to have everybody in the same city. And, as engineering software tools changed, then it was possible to kind of spread them out more. You could have distributed build systems and other kinds of things. But, now, even more so, you can have, people in different countries being very, very effective, being kind of plugged into the company in a way they weren't before. And, there may be more talent in Poland that's available to you than talent in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's right. How much in the sort of post-COVID, in office versus hybrid versus remote, kind of scenarios, like how much difference do you think companies can tolerate in terms of, some group of employees is required to be in the office 5 days a week, some group 3 days a week, some group once every 2 weeks, some groups are people fully remote. Like it's like the sort of, the sort of natural human impulse towards fairness. Like does at some point do people start to get like really frustrated and upset if they have colleagues who are more remote or completely remote? And as a CEO, like how do you navigate explaining to people that, people are going to be treated differently depending on what group they're in or when they were hired?
Yeah. So I think that, I don't think that like internal, maybe it's because we work mostly with startups and we're not that big ourselves. I think the internal equity thing is probably less of an issue than, if you're doing new things, you really it's very hard to do that all remote, I find. And in talking to, lots and lots of CEOs. So it's very easy. Like you have a plan. Now let's go execute it. And we're all executing to the plan and we're not really planning to change the plan much. That can be done more effectively, probably remotely, than putting everybody in the same office because you're not, talking about random stuff, shooting the shit, getting snacks, playing foosball, all that kind of thing. You're actually kind of working against a task. On the other hand, if you're like, okay, we need to build a brand new product to solve like some customer need that we've identified, and we've got to figure out how to design the thing, what the kind of storyboard flow is, how to architect it, who goes on what task, and so forth. That's really hard to do remotely because those are very, very long conversations. Sometimes you want them to take hours. I think most people can't pay attention on a Zoom for more than, 45 minutes or so tops. Whereas in a meeting, you can, and you can have a pretty intense discussion. So I think that's the main thing that drives, whether you want people together or you're like fine with them being remote. And some teams, like can do all their planning in like a short spurt. So they can do a 3-day offsite and do all their planning and all their new ideas. And then they just run with those ideas.
So I have a different point of view, different than what a lot of people would say on the terms of how creative work can happen. And so I would argue there's a very extreme barbell, which is you either need for truly creative work, like defining a new product, building something new. I would argue it's a full barbell, which is you either need everybody like right there in person for the reason that you articulated. But I think there's another side of the barbell, which is doing it entirely 100% online, and in particular over chat or over some sort of text-based system. And the reason is because open source, most of the big open source projects got built with people working remote. And almost like in our day, it would have been over Usenet, and then more recently it's over various kinds of messaging systems, and then Crypto projects tend to be done that way. But Bitcoin, as an example, was done that way. It was all over mailing lists.
They didn't even know she was.
Yeah, exactly right. And then we see this with some of the new generation software companies where they run like this and they're just on chat all the time. And of course, and we even, I mean, obviously we run a lot of in person also, but we have very active Slack and there is a real feeling that like everybody's kind of in the same virtual space all the time because we're all on Slack. And so I wonder if there's like a polar opposite where you can, but where you have to push it all the way to the other side of the barbell, which is you have to build intentionally to be like 100% in an online collaboration space with no expectation of in person, and maybe it's everything in the middle that just gets all fuzzed up.
Yeah, I definitely think that could be. And it's interesting. It's like I think it has to do a little bit also with the team dynamic and like what is the nature of the team leader and how do they work and so forth. And I see that this a lot with CEOs where like some CEOs are like, we don't do anything now that we're remote. Like I've got to get people back together. I don't know how to do it. Nothing happens. And then other CEOs are like, no, it's working great. And I think it has more to do with the CEO personality and whether they can't feel the work if they're not there. And so it seems like, oh, we're getting nothing done. And then something always goes wrong in the business. And then you go, well, the business is all messed up because we're remote or, or like things are going great because we're remote.
That's right.
Cargo cult idea.
Other factors. So we'll switch to talking about big companies. Actually, so Andy Aarons asks, how can these build new lessons, which is sort of what we've been talking about, be applied to mature companies in order to rebuild, refresh them without having to start from scratch? And I want to dig into this a bunch, but let me start with this question. Actually, I've been dying to ask you. So when you were an executive at HP, as I recall, tell me if this is right, for a short time, but I believe you were there at the time. I think and this was way pre-COVID. This was way pre-COVID, pre-remote. This was in the old days. I think it was the case that many of the senior executives lived in basically random locations and didn't actually live near their office. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. Yeah.
And then more recently, I bring it up because more recently,
they got more extreme than that. But yeah.
What do you mean? How so?
Well, during a period when I was there, they wanted to save money. Like they had this very interesting cost-cutting idea. It was actually a good lesson for me in incentives that if you pay the CEO based on earnings per share, and particularly quarterly earnings per share, which I think we did at HP, or at least annually. If you optimize for that, you can do things that would undermine long-term productivity. And one of the things that I remember them doing was they want to save money on chairs and desks. And so we actually had more employees than we had chairs and desks, which I guess either forced remote work or just forced people not to go to work, depending on how you looked at it.
Yeah, and it was, and I was on the board. I was on the board, so I had a perspective on it also. So yeah, it was basically the logic was overall real estate footprint.
Yeah.
Right, and so just total number of square footage, which translated into total number of cubicles.
Yeah.
Which did ultimately translate total number. It's literally total number of chairs. We did calculate. I think at one point we had 50,000 fewer office chairs than we had employees.
Yeah. I'm missing days of Zoom or remote work or anything, right? Like it was kind of interesting.
Exactly. And there was actually a big.
Fire all the engineers, you'll have higher earnings per share in the short term.
Yeah. Well, they did in those days. They did a lot of other things. They turned off one of the famous things that happened at HP in that era was they turned off the satellite music subscription for the company gym. And so the music when you worked out was 24-hour Christmas carols.
Yeah.
Maybe it's motivating to get your workout over with. But they had this thing specifically I recall where the executives lived in various locations, and then they had an offsite culture, right, for the execs where they would fly into various places. I think you famously at one point had to go to Thailand.
Yeah, I went to Thailand. I went to Jamaica, many places. Yeah, in my short time there, I was all over the world.
Yeah, exactly. But that was kind of where the executives would come together, was at these offsites. And then, and I also bring it up because this has been in the press coverage, and I don't know if this is true, but in the press coverage on Boeing, all the scrutiny that Boeing's under, there are very similar stories being told about them. And maybe it's not true, but the story being told is the executives don't actually all live near headquarters. They're sort of dispersed. And so one of the things people are wondering is, can you have a high functioning, airplane company where the executives literally are not together? And I just bring this up because, this is a natural consequence. I think more and more companies, operate in this way because in theory, if everybody's available on video all the time, does it really matter where people live? And, can you run a big company with having the 20 top executives in 20 locations? Like, do you think that can be made to work, or is that just like flat out a bad idea?
I think these things are more malleable around the nature of the business and the composition of the team. And so I do think that, like, if the team's been around a while, and they've been working together and it's very cohesive and the leader is just like very good at getting people together on an as needed basis and so forth, then I could definitely imagine it working. On the other hand, like if you have a brand new team with a new leader and so forth, like setting the culture, the expectation and so forth, it's just a lot more complicated when people are remote. I think like in the Boeing case, I think the big problem was the CEO was an accountant. Like, I mean, nothing against accountants, but like, what do they know about building airplanes? I mean, this is like, I think it's important that the person running the organization understands the core thing that the company does.
You would never cut it as a Harvard Business School professor with an attitude like that.
Yeah, exactly. They're just making widgets. Yeah, building an airplane, it seems like awfully complicated to me. And so if you didn't really understand that at a very detailed level, like it's hard to imagine you kind of seeing when things start to go adrift or sensing, okay, like, yeah, this isn't right. If you're just going up like, what were the earnings per share? Turns out the spreadsheet's not actually the business, despite what you may learn in business school.
Yes, exactly. So when we talked to, let me back up. During COVID, there were a lot of discussions in public, and we talked about this a lot, which was like, wow, these big companies, every big company CEO had this massive realization kind of all at the same time, which was like, oh my God, we can just move everybody online, move everybody to Zoom, and the company keeps operating, right? And it was actually quite remarkable in that era that basically every big company and actually every basically functional system in society that, that was like an operation, just kept running. Like the stock exchanges kept running and the banks kept running. Like I would have predicted like a much higher level of chaos. But like basically just like stuff kept running. And so maybe companies weren't innovating as much or whatever, but, or maybe people were less productive, but fundamentally everything kept running. And so I remember a lot of conversations with big company CEOs during that period, which was like, wow, now that I know that, I can now think about doing permanent reengineering for my company. So even, after COVID, it's like, okay, if I used to have 100,000 people in Manhattan, maybe now I can have 20,000 people in Manhattan and have the other 80,000 people in North Carolina or North Dakota or, or the Philippines or somewhere else. So sort of many conversations along these lines. Do you how do you think that's played out in practice? Have big companies been doing that, or did they just kind of go back to the way things were before as COVID sort of came to an end?
I can tell you, our companies have moved a lot of jobs, and it's been surprising to me because, and in particular, like a lot of engineering jobs have gotten moved as a result of COVID, and it's funny. There's still like many companies in San Francisco, just as many, but there are definitely fewer kind of engineers in that. Both a lot of engineers have moved out, and then a lot of the engineers that those companies hired have sprung up, in all over the country and in other countries. So I definitely think that's happened, and it depends. What companies are kind of like people in that. If they have to do something, they'll do it. And if they don't have to, they won't. And so the companies, I think a lot of it happened after 2021 when, like money got tight and people were like, okay, how do I do it? And I know I can move stuff now, so I will. And it's also like, it's a way to do a reduction in force in a way that's not as or doesn't feel as draconian as you go, oh, well, like your job's still here. It's just moved to Singapore. So if you'd like to live in Singapore, we'd be happy to have you. And then, all of a sudden you have fewer employees as well. So I think all that kind of comes into play, but for sure, I think companies think about how they can change much differently than they did pre-COVID.
Yeah, it's sort of Ben pointed out, there's this interesting phenomenon for most big companies, not all, we could talk about the exceptions, but for most big companies, there's this pattern that sort of goes with the broader economic cycle, which is during an expansionary boom period where stock prices are rising and the economy is doing well. Companies basically just grow, and they just like add, they add projects and they add people and they add resources, and and it's because their revenue is going up and they can afford to, and it's great and everybody's kind of having a good time, and it's it seems like the whole thing is working. And then there's this corresponding period where, when the stock market, takes a big hit, or the economy enters recession, or, there's just generally, something, horrible happens, like September 11th or the global financial crisis or COVID. Then it's sort of this like basically, oh shit moment where people are like, oh God, like, the business is going to contract, or at least the growth rate is going to slow way down and we have to get more efficient and I'm not going to hit my EPS targets. And so I have to cost cut. And so basically it's sort of this weird paradox, which is, to your point, like companies basically only do the cost cutting, rationalization, efficiency work under duress. Yeah. And the duress is usually caused by something macro. They often wish that they had used the boom times to do that work because it's a lot, because in theory, at least if during boom times
they'd have a lot more cash.
Yeah, exactly. And so they often get under sort of extreme stress during the down cycles. But that is, and so there's a picture you can paint that basically says that basically productivity improvement in the economy, like sort of people doing things more efficiently in the economy, is a function of down cycles, not up cycles.
Yeah.
Right.
100%.
And so, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Look, there's always a reason. You can rationalize why you're not going to get more productive in any kind of boom cycle. You can go, well, like, yeah, we would be a lot more productive. And yeah, like, probably 20% of the people that we have aren't doing anything, but like it would mess up the culture to do it now. And, we have plenty of money and everybody's making money and it's all good. And so, I mean, I think it's a lot the nature of human organizations. I remember I had a conversation with Andy Grove years ago where I asked him some question about like, well, why do people change like the way they do things like that? And he's like, or he had an insight, like your insight. And I said, well, you should write a book on that. He said, why would I do that? And I said, well, what do you mean? Because it's you're right. And he said, yeah, but like it's human nature. People can read a book that goes against human nature. They're just not going to do anything.
Yeah.
No, I like that. But he's probably right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so what I observed, by the way, I should also highlight, not all companies are like this. And what I learned, so at HP when I was on the board, we worked with this activist named Ralph Whitworth, who has unfortunately since passed away, but was sort of a legend in the activist community and actually joined our board and had a big stake in the company. And what he taught me during that period is that it goes, Ben, I bring it up because it goes to your earnings per share thing. What he taught me basically is earnings per share the earnings per share as a metric, or just more generally, a lot of managers are sort of incented by kind of size of empire. And it's sort of like just aggregate revenue growth, or even like aggregate spend, just like the number of heads, the empire building, the number of heads that people have under them. But even earnings per share, he would say, is a bad way to motivate for the reason that you described, which is it's sort of just okay, that's some percentage of revenue, but that takes you back to basically having revenue be your target, empire building, expansion being your thing. And he basically said that he said basically the way to get companies to basically to run in a mode where they're sort of continuously trying to get more efficient, if that's what you want, is to shift compensation instead to the financial metric of return on invested capital. And so it's to basically measure every dollar coming into the business, as sort of equity dollars, and then measure the actual return on those dollars. And if there's something that you can do, and then you basically, what he said basically is, and he did this at HP actually, and it was very successful, was you basically, if you tie executive compensation to ROIC, you have this thing where all of a sudden people are like, wow, even though it's an upcycle, if I can go make it more efficient, I can boost my ROIC and I can get this like disproportionate bump in the stock price. I can get and then I get like directly paid on that. And so he viewed that as the lever to be able to basically get people into this mode that normally they'll only get to during down cycles. But he said you have to fundamentally change the incentive away from expansion. And because and then the question is like, what's wrong with expansion? He said what's wrong with expansion is as companies grow, they basically reach further and further into basically worse and worse lower margin businesses in order to continue to grow. And so they're trying to empire build, they're trying to grow revenue, they're trying to grow earnings. And so an example is they go into more and more countries that are just less profitable to operate in. Or they go into they have product line extensions that are just less profitable, or they're doing acquisitions that are just less profitable. And so even though earnings per share might be growing through that, from an economic standpoint, those companies are getting less efficient. Return on investor capital is dropping, and then you basically over time become a giant inefficient mess, which is what a lot of big companies turn into. And so anyway, there is a way to run big companies like it goes to your anti-growth thing. Like if Ralph had written a book, it would have been, this is how all companies should run all the time.
Yeah.
But that book would be equally unlikely to be read as Andy's book, because it's the kind of thing that managers do not voluntarily take on themselves. It generally has to be enforced by an activist at some point.
Right. It's really interesting. Well, not only does it need to be enforced by an activist, but there's no growth investor who looks at it that way, right? So from when you're a little company, kind of before you run into that particular issue, through when you go public, you're kind of very, very, very incentivized to grow. Growth has a tremendous amount of value, and even if it is ultimately going to be bad, inefficient, low margin growth, you get rewarded for it in the short term. So that's a very interesting thing. Like, could you actually earlier in the life of a company?
Yeah. So what Ralph said on this, he said, look, every company started as a growth company.
Yeah.
Right. And so there was a time when like all of these companies were like fancy high tech startups of their era.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. And that's built into their DNA now.
Exactly. And then, 10 or 30 or 80 or 150 years later, they're still trying to get growth, right? Because it's human nature. As you said, you want to expand.
GE, right? They did that crazy, probably fraudulent, insane GE finance thing that kept the earnings per share going. But ultimately, without a bailout from the U.S. government, the company would be gone, right?
Yeah, exactly. So,
and that was, I don't know how 100 years after Thomas Edison.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And so, he said sort of the cardinal. He said, look, the cardinal sin of if you're a true growth company, you don't want to do this. If you're a true growth company, if you can actually get growth, like actual like high velocity, high margin growth, in a new market, like that's fantastic. You should go do that. But there comes a time in the life cycle of every company, he would say, where that has stopped. Like that's just over. Like you've done that. Your market is now mature. You've done that. And he said at that point, basically executives will spend, arbitrary amounts of time and effort and then company resources in order to try to chase, to kind of respark the growth, relight the growth. And then when they do that, they sort of financially, they financially, economically take the company off a cliff. And then they wonder why investors are all mad and the stock price isn't going up. And he's like, basically, it's like, you well-intentioned idiots. You need to think more like an investor. And as an investor, you think in terms of like, okay, I put in $1, what do I get out? And that's sort of the core internal economic efficiency, which is a much less fun thing to think about than just top line growth, but is actually the way to then get, actually have shareholder value and a sort of rationally run company where you're actually pursuing the right opportunities in the out years.
Yeah. Well, and it also kind of causes you to re-examine, money you're putting into old things and whether they're actually generating any kind of return.
Yeah. And like, there's a lot of, we see this, we see this a lot in tech. It's just, there are, I should name it. There are legacy tech products that are, very widely used today that have very big businesses, and they'll have, 5 or 10 or 15 or 20,000 engineers working on them. And the last new feature anybody cared about was a decade ago. And
well, it's funny, right? There was that Charles Wang's company's CA was like the great geniuses of buying those companies and then taking out all the expense.
Yeah, exactly. And so anyway, the reason I went through all that is because it is it's kind of been a down cycle. It's been a weird economy for the last few years because the COVID kind of economic takeoff was super weird. And then, the COVID sort of, then everybody getting bummed after COVID ended was kind of weird. And then the inflation thing has been weird. And then you're in this mode right now where in theory, the economy is doing well, but a lot of people, as we talked about last time, don't feel it because of inflation. So it is this weird thing, but it feels like, I bring it up because it feels to me like there's going to be at some point, there's going to be a severe recession. No idea when, but at some point there will be. And at some point there are big companies. If you're a big company CEO, there's going to be an opportunity at some point to really, I think, do radical restructuring with all of these new technologies and methods. And maybe at that point it will be half, really trying to get to the bottom of exactly where the workforce should be located. And then maybe the other half will be how to incorporate AI. But it feels like a lot of big companies have a fundamental restructuring ahead of them that hasn't happened yet.
They do, but I'm still skeptical just because there are the new ways to do it that they'll actually do it to that degree. I mean, it was interesting, and there's a big set of big company layoffs, right? And it was really interesting to see Elon reduce X by 80%, and then everybody else had numbers like 8 or 10 or 15%. And companies of the same generation with the same kind of growth, with the same basically profile. And it's hard to imagine that the optimal gap of how many kind of people you could let go was really that large. Maybe, but doesn't seem that way.
A lot of companies, I had a lot of conversations with a lot of CEOs kind of over the last 5 years, and there's all this kind of lore around layoffs, I find. See what you think of this. There's like all this lore and kind of stories that get told. And so it's like, okay, we're going to do a layoff. We need to cut costs. And we knew that we overhired and we got sloppy shit all over the place. And so we're going to do a layoff. And like, we don't want to do a 5% layoff because like layoffs are traumatic. And so you don't want to 5% is like too low. But like, boy, if it's double digits, that's really going to damage morale. Right. That's going to feel really bad. And so we'll do 8%. Or they'll have that same conversation. They need to do more. They'll say, well, we need to do more than that. But boy, at 15%, it's really going to hurt. So we're going to do 13%. And so you get this like nibble around the edges thing where they're literally backing into almost this intangible idea of like some sort of minimax number where it's going to be enough to get credit, but not enough where people get mad.
Yeah.
Do you find that to be the case? I have heard it. I've experienced that a lot. Have you seen that?
People definitely do that. I think so. There's a couple of reality thresholds in a cut. So the first, if you do any cut, then you've broken trust with the employees. So you've kind of created a cultural problem in the sense that, okay, I gave you a job. I told you this was going to be great. And then I let you go. So I broke a promise. I broke trust. Trust is very important. So if you do any layoff, you have to rebuild trust. So that's problem one, the first kind of threshold of badness. There's a second threshold of badness where, okay, if you're letting go of kind of new / mediocre people, that has one kind of effect. If you start letting go of either genius people or people that are the most popular people in the company and so forth, in large numbers, then that has a greater effect than just breaking trust. And then I think at the highest level, when the company, which nobody ever cuts to this level, but the company just can't even function, is kind of the third level. And I think that what happens is companies don't know where that second level is, and they often think it's way, way, way lower percentage than it really is. So what's a 50% cut might get you into, they think happens at 12%. And I have seen that a lot.
Do you find, by the way, a related thing on that is, I forget is it Price's law? It's there's one of these laws named after a person, but it's I think the law is the square root of the number of employees generate 50% of the output.
That seems right. I mean, look, some of it gets back to knowledge, right? So particularly in a startup, what often happens is the original people, particularly in the product areas, have amazing knowledge because they've been there the whole time. They know every product decision that was made. They know every customer that got pissed off. They know every deal that was lost and so forth. And so they're very, very productive because they can make really sharp decisions very fast. And then they know how the company works. And then people who join that, we had this problem at Netscape in a huge way. People who join that, 800 people, 1,000 people, don't know how the company works, don't have good judgment and so forth. So even if they're good people, they have a hard time being productive. And so you kind of get to this feeling where the same people, no matter how many people we hire, the same people are doing all the work. Like that is a real thing. And so, this is, I would say you can do better than that if you've got really great onboarding, really great training, and then high performance standards. Like if you do all those things, like I like Ali's company, Databricks, they're really, really good at that. I think Zuck did an amazing job in the early days for sure at Meta on that, where, their onboarding program was so good that they were able to just keep turning out, massive numbers of very high quality products for a really long time. More how it is now. I won't ask you to comment on it, whether it's good or bad, but there are companies who I would say are better than the square root. What was the exact equation? The square root of the number of employees.
Yes, I pulled it up. So it's a guy named Derek DeSola Price, and who was actually a physicist who worked on these issues. And it's the specific law is the square root of the number of contributors generates approximately 50% of the output. And if I could just spend a moment on that, square root's an interesting thing because the square root of 100 is 10. And so 10 people, an organization of 100, 10 people are producing half the output. But in an organization of 10,000, the square root is 100. And so what's so great about the square root here is it really gets to, at least if you take the law at face value, it really gets to this thing, which is like, wow, even when you're at massive scale, it's still a very small number of people producing half the output. And by the way, we'll talk here for a moment about half the output. I think, tell me if you'd agree with this. I think you can see this in engineering, where you have some small number of engineers who are doing much of the great work. You see it in product management, where it's the same group of people, same small group of people doing all the breakthrough work. You see it also in sales, where you generally, like enterprise sales, you generally have a few reps that have like these.
Well,
in
enterprise sales, enterprise sales, so the distribution on kind of performance against quota. The bigger the deals, the bigger the wider the distribution. So when it actually when it takes a lot of skill, right. If you're
so you'll have it. So for people who don't know this, you'll have if you have enterprise sales, if you're selling stuff to businesses, you'll have a large number of people who just like sell stuff to businesses, and you'll then have a small number of like these hyper sort of competent people, sales reps, and you may pay them $1 million a year or more.
Yeah.
And they have these giant accounts that are extremely complicated and extremely large. And it's just they're just like Jedi masters at like dealing with that. And you always wish you had more of them, but you have a few of them.
Wow.
And then when you tally up all the sales at the end of the year, it's like, oh yeah, that group of whatever 10 people generated half the revenue, and the other 1,000 people generated the other. Like, that's a fairly routine thing. And then, by the way, Ben, we can also say the same thing is true. The same thing is true actually in two other areas of organizations. One is by country.
Yeah.
Just the nature of the distribution of countries is that a small number of countries are going to generate most of your revenue. And then you also see it of product lines, which is most companies have one or two products that generate most of the revenue.
Yeah.
I mean, Google is an example. Like Google Search is still, some giant percentage of the revenue, and if you basically like, and by the way, and then Google Search plus YouTube is like most of the revenue, right? And then they've got 100 other products that are a tiny. So anyway, it's this power law curve thing that you just see over and over again, and as the reason that why Price's law is so provocative is because, and connect it back to the ROIC thing that we were talking about earlier, is it's just like, okay, like what are you running the company for? And like, at the end of the day, like there is this question of like, okay, why do we have the other? Why do we have the other?
It's really interesting. So I have two related comments. So on the one hand, I would say I do think with really good management, it might go from the square root of the number of employees to the square root times like 3 or 4 of the number of employees or something like that, where you can get kind of quite a bit better. But we had that like a really interesting kind of meeting with Jensen from NVIDIA, where he was just pointing out that the reason NVIDIA is still so productive is because it is really small. Like if you look at their headcount against their market cap, it's a remarkably small company. And
just you mean just in terms of raw headcount?
Yeah, raw headcount for like somebody who makes complicated chips and stuff.
Right.
So it is interesting. I think that's mostly correct. I do think there's a lot of things that you can do, like Hewlett Packard, or the original Hewlett Packard, not like pre-computers Hewlett Packard, I think did a remarkable job of scaling the company through org design without hitting that law as hard. For example, and they basically organized into, very independently run businesses that weren't tied together at the hip, in the way other things are. Yeah.
Although you know why that ended. You know why the specific reason that ended was Price's Law again, which was the computer industry ended up. Business
became the biggest business by like a factor of like 50. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. And every other business, all of a sudden, and other businesses that have been perfectly good businesses at smaller scale, all of a sudden were just rounding errors.
Yep. No, that is, yep. The power law wins in the end. Although, like, it ran 40 years or 30 years that way.
Yeah,
it's a long time.
Yeah, for a long time. Okay, good. That actually takes us to another really provocative question. Ashraf asks, do you think it's finally possible for a one-person billion-dollar startup? And I would say, and again, this is in this sort of post-COVID. You could put a whole bunch of things in this bucket. It's the inherent scalability of software and the internet, but you could also say, AI, and then you could also just say, contracting, outsourcing. Did you have one person at $1 billion startup? And I'll just volunteer and I'll say, well, you already do. It already exists. It's Bitcoin. And so there's experiment.
$1 trillion startup.
Yeah, Bitcoin's a $1 trillion outcome with one guy with a bunch of people kind of weighing in and helping, but.
It's also thinking skims.
Okay, go ahead.
Company, right?
Explain that. Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Well, skims is kind of a personality, and endorsement, and then nothing else in that company I don't think has to be permanent. I don't know much about skims, but I imagine like she could just hire some top designers and outsource the manufacturer and put it online, and there she is. And I think it's worth $1 billion, or well over $1 billion.
More.
Like, there you go.
More. Yeah, that's right. Maybe Dolly can design the next set of clothes.
Yeah, well, Bitcoin's a better example though, because $1 trillion.
Bitcoin's good. Ethereum's pretty close. The Ethereum core team, it wasn't one person, but it was a pretty small core team.
Yeah, and I do think the invention, or the original invention, was largely Vitalik, as I understand it, and then he had certainly great people around him.
And then other nominations here obviously is Instagram. Instagram was $1 billion sale with 11 people, and then WhatsApp was a $15+ billion sale with 50 people. So they're again, and then probably the most provocative one is Telegram, which is a shoestring operation. And by the way, for people who haven't followed Telegram, it's this very interesting story. And actually, Pavel Durov, who's there's two brothers, the Durov brothers, who did VKontakte, which was the social networking company in Russia that the Russian government seized actually at one point, and then they did Telegram after that. They're very they don't talk, they don't show up in public much. And Pavel Durov, who's the CEO, just did a long form interview with Tucker Carlson where he goes through in detail kind of how they run the thing. And I think it's 1 billion users, and I don't know, I remember exactly the head count, but it's a tiny number of people. So Ben, would we expect what especially in the sort of new world of AI, how many of these does this thing just are these things one-off flukes for the next 20 years, or do you think we'll start to see a tempo of sort of super geniuses who will figure out how to harness AI, and all of a sudden we'll see more of this pattern?
Yeah, I think we'll see more of it. I think the internet is actually probably in some ways a bigger breakthrough than AI on it, and that the being able to distribute over the internet, versus the way companies were built prior. Like so much of the headcount goes into distribution. And so I think the distribution kind of cost for something like Telegram was, like no AI, just the internet. And they're able to do that. And then you add AI in, although I'm getting a little more skeptical about the distance between like what we can do now with Copilot to complete human elimination, just in terms of the technologies that we've seen. Like that last mile is a long mile, bro. It is not. We're going to need a breakthrough to get to there. So we're not quite at the point where you go, okay, like all my coders are AIs. At least like that doesn't exist yet. And we'll see. But like, I think we're further away than I thought we were. I'll just put it that way.
So that would be your theory there is sort of similar to sort of the observation people have made with self-driving cars, right? Which is like, there's like a tremendous, if it's rote work, fine. But the minute there's an edge case, you have a problem. And the world is filled with edge cases.
Yes.
And so that last 10 or 20% actually takes, a long time.
Yeah. I had a really interesting conversation with Jan Stoika the other day, the professor at Stanford, and he was saying, like you kind of think, well, like this isn't that hard a problem. You've got the, you've got the software generation that comes out of the model, and then you can have the model write test cases and the model test it. And if it doesn't work, and he says, but it turns out that that's not actually true because like the test case will be wrong. And the results of the test will be wrong, and then the fix will be wrong. And so like, it just turns out to be harder than it looks, amazingly. So we'll see. I mean, like, we'll see. But I will like, you would have thought that, like in a way, like, hey, why isn't it done now? And we're not, like, we haven't seen anything and then the other thing is that a lot of the kind of examples are always on very, very well-defined problems, right? But almost no interesting engineering problems are like really well-defined. So like build Telegram. Okay, is well-defined now, but it wasn't well-defined then. And anyhow, yes. So very interesting.
Yeah, that's right. I'm probably a little bit more optimistic, just in the sense of I think progress in reasoning is actually going to move pretty. The combination of it just turns out you can keep training these things and they get smarter.
Yeah.
That was a key part of the Llama news. This week is
watch the interview with Zuck where he went through that. It was very, very interesting. Like they don't even know when it stops getting smart.
Yeah, so for people who haven't been paying attention to this, there's been this theory for a long time that you basically take input into train an AI, and you have the chips all set up and everything, and then you train it up to a point. You let the training process run for a certain amount of time, and then you hit a point of diminishing returns, and at some point you stop training and release it. And you just at some point you just can't make the model smarter by training it more, and it's turning out there's more and more cases now where people are realizing, no, actually if you keep training it, and actually if you keep training it to what people used to think were kind of absurd extents, like if you train it to be like 100, train it for 100 times longer than the sort of predictions would have suggested,
and on synthetic data, right? Like, and that,
right,
which is the other like, whoa.
And then there's also this thing increasingly where you train. There's a specific form of synthetic data, which is you run it. You sort of train it up. You train it to do this sort of, they call chain of thought reasoning. So you train it to solve problems across multiple steps, but then you actually retrain the model based on the result of that, and then all of a sudden it can solve those problems in a single step. And so this is the sort of self-improvement loop that people have been looking for a long time. And apparently that method is really starting to work. And so, it may be that there's an iterative process here you can get where, even if it can't do something out of the box, you basically handhold it for the first time through, and then you retrain it, and all of a sudden it can do it.
Right.
So
yeah, that's interesting. So, you're actually pushing the know-how down into the model. So it's not going to be, maybe it won't be a layer above the model that kind of works with the model to get you all the way to the right answer, but it'll be part of the training set that makes the model smart enough that it can generalize.
Yeah, or both, or literally both of those. You do that first part first. You help it through the multi-step process.
Yeah.
Right. But then you retrain on the basis of that result, and then next time it doesn't need the handholding. Which, by the way, it's also kind of how people work, right? Like, it's like, okay, I teach you to do a new task. We're going to sit and do it together. I do this with my kid all the time, right? Step by step by step, and then he's like, oh, okay, now I get it. Now he goes off and he's able to do it himself. Like that's not a that's not a crazy concept.
Yeah. Well, no, that'll be interesting to see how far that goes.
Exactly. So we will see. Anyway, so Ashraf, very very good question. I think this is going to be a key. Oh, and then the other question, Ben and I debate a lot. It's probably premature, but just like how many jobs, just like how many jobs in a startup, and sort of the same question, but how many jobs in a startup could you think about over time automating? And my favorite example of this is everybody assumes. Here's my provocative thing I'll bring up with people: is everybody assumes that white collar knowledge work, like call center work, respond to customer service requests. Okay, we're going to convert that to AI, but of course you're still going to have a human manager overseeing the AI, call center bots. And the question I always ask is, well, are we sure it's not the other way around?
Yeah, the AI bot training the humans.
Exactly, right. As a human call center rep talking to people on the phone and having a human connection, maybe you actually work for the bot. In other words, maybe it's actually easier to automate the manager job than it is the worker job. Mm-hmm. And look, it goes to this very interesting question of what do workers expect from their managers? And I think everybody has an idealized model of what a great manager is. Most managers, in most businesses are not great.
Yeah.
Most people have had experiences with mediocre or bad managers, and if you had an AI bot that was super sympathetic and super supportive and always happy to mentor you and teach you, and always had
We actually have an investment in a company, Cresta AI, that kind of takes that approach, which is what the AI does is it trains the call center people. Basically, it coaches them. It literally step by step. How do you answer the call? What do you say when they say this, and that, and the other, in real time, which is probably a better manager than any call center manager, because they're they never get tired. They're very precise in the answers that they make, and so forth. So could be, yeah.
And they never get frustrated, right? They never get frustrated.
Yep.
They're 24/7. If you're trying to figure out something at 2 a.m. on the night shift, they're happy to talk to you about it. They never get drunk. They never get high. They never have issues at home.
And interestingly, they need the worker in the loop, the human worker in the loop, because of the edge cases, right? Who knows what the person on the other end of the phone is going to say? Could be something completely unanticipated. And it turns out that humans are very good at adapting to that. When machines can go a little haywire.
Yes,
Like what was
right.
the Microsoft one, Tay? Off the handle from time to time.
Well, Tay became a Nazi, so that was the
the other AIs, the modern AI, solved that by just refusing to answer any questions.
Exactly, her turning the Nazis black. So the more prosaic version of that recently was I think this actually was technology that predate. No, it must have been an LLM because of how it behaved, but I think it was one of the airlines. I won't name names. One of the airlines had a case where they had a customer service bot provided by a third party, and apparently there's this thing, or some airlines have this so-called bereavement policy where you can get a ticket refund or whatever for flying to a funeral of your parents or something. And so there was an airline apparently that didn't have that policy, but they had a customer service bot, and the person was like, I have to go see my this, that, and apparently the bot literally made up a bereavement policy on the fly. It's just like, we're all about customer service, and we really support you in your hour of need, and of course we'd be happy to, per our supported bereavement policy, we'd be happy to do this, that, and the other thing. And of course, why did it do that? It did that for two reasons. One is because it knew presumably about bereavement policies, because it knew about all the information about the internet about this topic, and then the bots, it's trying to be friendly, it's trying to give you answers that you're going to like, Right. And so, and then there was another case where a car dealership, I think it was a Chevy dealership, that put up a customer service bot, and within a few days, it discovered the bot was trying to convince potential customers to buy Teslas.
To be helpful.
To be helpful, right? To be helpful. It's like, well, do you care about the environment? Oh, yeah, I care about the. Oh, yeah, then you should consider buying an all-electric car like a Tesla. Um, let me tell you about all the new great Tesla cars, right? And so anyway, like to your point on edge cases, like there's going to be there's a fair amount of work to be done here, and maybe the actual job of manager is actually the bounded job, and then that you fan out to the people. Anyway,
right. The manager can train on all the known cases.
Yes,
and then you
exactly. So I think
human to deal with the edge case.
This is going to be the great exploration of the next decade. Try to figure this stuff out. Okay. All right. Slightly different topic. Actually, very interesting. So Nate asks, to what extent did California's COVID policy, and here I think what he means by that is, basically the long lockdowns, lots of controls for a long time. California was the earliest state to go into lockdown and have sort of very, let's say strong / harsh lockdown policies. And then it was so it was the first state to lock down, and then it was one of the last states to open up. So to what extent did California's COVID policy contribute to the spread of startups to other states?
Yeah. So,
and I have go ahead.
Yeah. So I'd be interested in your view. So what I've observed is it's not been as much the spread of. There has been some spread of startups to other states. I think the more dramatic effect was the spread of engineers and employees to other states, which has been profound. And you can see it in the numbers in California, where I think more people have left California than any other state in the last couple of years. But, the blossoming of many startup hubs, we're not quite seeing it the way that I think people thought it would happen. So New York has definitely a pretty vibrant startup environment. The ones that were before, like Seattle and LA are kind of where they were. People thought Austin and Miami would emerge. Austin is kind of gotten, I'd say, a little more robust, and Miami not very robust so far, at least, from our observation. So I don't think, what people thought might happen, which is like it really spreads out, hasn't happened as much, but the people have really spread out. I would say the workers are all over the place now. Which by the way I think are going to be an interesting challenge for California from a fiscal standpoint, because that was a huge source of tax revenue. And we've kind of not seen it for that reason, but for the reason that there haven't been a lot of IPOs lately. California's got a small minor deficit problem.
Yes, went from a giant surplus to a giant deficit in one step.
Yeah, that was amazing.
So, by the way, New York is an even more dramatic case of what you're talking about. Like a very large percentage of the top taxpayers in New York, which is a lot of the tax base, have moved to Florida because it finds finance as opposed to tech, but in finance. Yeah, and it's such an easy.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, the hedge funds all moved to Florida, right? Well, and the principal moved in the hedge fund case, which is different than in the tech case, I think.
And there's several things that have catalyzed that. That's been a dramatic story in New York. Several things catalyze that. One is that it's just easy to get to Florida. It turns out it's a short flight from New York to Florida, a couple hours. Number two, tax. New York is a very high tax state. Florida is a very low tax state for individuals. Third is the weather. And a lot of New York finance people already had second homes in Florida anyway.
They were going to retire there anyway, so might as well.
Might as well get a jump on it. And then the other is just, as we talked about last time, but the crime, dysfunction stuff. And then, by the way, the weather also, sort of this big push. And then, finance, a lot of the hedge fund jobs are relatively fungible, and you have as much access to, your Bloomberg terminal in Miami as you do in New York. So that's been a big shift. And that's people in New York very concerned, both in New York City and New York State, very concerned about the tax base, which I think is a legitimate concern.
Yeah, I think somebody said it's like 5,000 families in New York are half the tax base, or maybe it's more. It's like a crazy number. When I heard it, I was like, wow. It's kind of the dark side of the progressive tax is if they move, it's not a lot of movement that causes the entire budget to go bananas.
Yeah, that's right. So the extreme, I think that's right in New York. The extreme, if I recall correctly, but the extreme version was California in the year 2000. In the year 2000, the top is it go back to the price is a lot thing. In the year 2000, 50% of tax revenues in California were from the top 1,000 taxpayers. California is a very big state, and so like that's a dramatic statement. Now, if you're on the left, you're at this point you're howling because you're like, well, that's just because of income inequality and like how unfair society is. But if you're trying to like pay the bills of a state,
those guys have to yeah.
And if they're not in your state, like you have a big problem. And yeah, to your point, this is the natural consequence of a progressive tax policy, which is to say a tax policy that taxes higher earners higher than it does lower earners. Which generally is viewed in our society as a moral thing to do. It just has this side effect, which can be very, very pernicious.
If you take it to that extreme, right, where if everybody, and I think it's like half of the country pays taxes or something like that. Like it's a smaller percentage than one might think, and that's it's great in a way in that, you don't want to tax people when they're kind of struggling to make ends meet, but it isn't robust in that, people move is a problem.
Yeah, that's right. And then different states have different ways of gathering tax revenue. And so there are states that don't have state income tax or have it very low because they have other ways of getting income. So,
yeah.
Or they have other population distribution such that they just don't need as much money or whatever it is. So yeah, and then by the way, there's another side of it. I don't know how common this is, but I've seen instances of it now. I'm curious, Ben, if you've run into this yet. Have you seen a case yet where you go to a retail store and there's a customer service person on a screen instead of in person? So it's a live human being on a screen that you can talk to.
I haven't
Have you seen this?
Yeah, no, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
So apparently this is just starting. And so like, for example, you could do, you have all these, we talked last time about all the legal changes that are leading to fast food restaurants using more robots and kiosks.
Yeah.
And so I've seen cases now where you walk in and it's an automated, whatever, everything's automated, but there is a human being you can talk to. It's just the human being's not actually in the store.
Oh yeah. Are they like on a beam, a mobile thing, or are they?
Yeah. No, they're just like on a big screen, just on a big Zoom. It's just like basically their 8-hour shift on a Zoom screen, and they talk to whoever walks up to it. Wow. And they're super happy, and thir sitting at home and they're having a great time, and they're doing customer service for a restaurant or food outlet or whatever it is. And so it's yeah. And so it's like, well, this is the sort of the full version of this would be sort of the idea that with sort of sufficiently advanced ubiquitous video conferencing, all of a sudden immigration law becomes less relevant, right? Because like if it's perfectly legal to stream bits across a border. Mm-hmm. Even if it's not possible for people to move across the border.
Right.
So, if you have sufficiently ubiquitous screens everywhere, cameras everywhere, remote, telepresence robots, all this stuff, does it really, at some point, for more and more like regular jobs, does it matter? Well, another example is,
working. Yeah, right. There's of course some jobs like picking fruit that still, at least today, we don't have good robots or anything for that.
Well, that's what's interesting. Again, it's just like with the knowledge work jobs, or in this case, like customer service jobs, are easier to either automate or they're easier to replace with a person on a screen, to your point, than something that is manual labor. And so the assumption in our field forever has been that we automate the low value tasks first, like cleaning toilets. And then later we automate, graphic design or something. And it turns out it's like the other way around, right?
Yep. Software engineering first.
right, exactly. Or management or whatever, right? And so it turns out there's these intermediate kind of customer service jobs. And another example of this is I don't know this to be, Ben, I don't know if you know this to be a fact, but I think for the Waymo self-driving cars, I think there's a human supervisor who can take over. Right. And I think each supervisor is responsible for some set of the cars, if they run into an edge case, like a police, stop point or something like that. But those people don't need to be in California. They can be anywhere.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Just
Well,
remote work.
as long as they don't have to be in the car, they could be anywhere at all, right?
They can be anywhere. And then it turns out, did you see Amazon? There was news, I think, this week. Amazon they had these stores. They had they had these retail stores they were doing for like groceries, where it was the just walk out. And so you like load up you load up all your food, and then you just like walk out. You don't even do the self checkout. You just walk out, and payment is magic. And it turned out the key to the whole thing was a lot of people in India watching on cameras. Right, which is just like, it's just like the obvious way to do it. And, there's somebody sitting in Bangalore or something who's just keeping a tally of like, Ben just put 2 gallons of milk in his cart, right?
That's so
right.
funny.
And so, and maybe that was the prototype for what one day could have been a fully automated, kind of thing or whatever. But anyway, the point being is like, maybe you have a lot more economic activity spreading out.
Yeah.
Not even just because of AI or even remote work, but also actual job redefinition.
Yeah.
Hilarious. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so yep. Okay, good. And then this is a kind of a fun question. This is a meme question, but I'll explain it. Bobby Lancaster asks, should startups implement a 90-minute morning coffee ban to increase productivity?
This is the Andrew Huberman idea.
This is the online fight I'm always having with my friend Andrew Huberman, which is Andrew Huberman is always citing, he's a Stanford professor and has studied all this health stuff, and he's always citing this evidence that basically says people are overly addicted to caffeine, and so if you don't drink caffeine in the first 90 minutes after you wake up, you don't get the fall offs later in the day. When you go into like basically you have caffeine becomes less effective. So it's sort of a way to make caffeine effective across the entire day. My response to that is no. Under no circumstances am I going to not have caffeine in the first 90 minutes. I don't care what the science says. Those first 90 minutes are important to me. I'm trying to wake up. I'm trying to be in a good mood. I'm in caffeine withdrawal. Give me my cup of coffee and stop talking to me about science.
Yeah.
And so that's the joke. But the serious version of the question would be, this is actually a serious question, less a company question, but more of a general life question of what you're saying, is nicotine. So it's of course very socially acceptable in our culture for everybody to be drinking caffeine all day long.
Yeah.
Nicotine went very badly out of style, obviously, with the kind of war on smoking. And then there's at least parts of society in which it's becoming very much back in style through Zyn is like and then there's this company Lucy that that our friends at formerly at Soylent are doing, and so there's these new non-smoke caffeine or nicotine delivery systems, and I know 2 people in particular who are like on nicotine basically all day every day, and they both say it's just like they're just like completely in love with it.
It may even make you smarter. So there's some like neuroplasticity nicotine pathway. So it may not only like not be bad for you and keep you completely alert, but it may make you like learn stuff better.
And then there's a fair amount of historical, I don't know if it's historical evidence, but there are historians that will basically say that, there was a time when people generally were like drinking alcohol all day. Back, hundreds of years ago, it was actually fairly common for people to drink alcohol all day, in part because life sucked and they wanted to be drunk, but in part because it was hard to get clean drinking water. And so if you drink alcohol,
my favorite W.C. Fields joke. He said, I don't drink water because I don't drink anything that fish fuck in.
Exactly. And so, and basically the argument that historians would say a culture that runs on alcohol and then other forms of like barbiturous depressants, it's just going to be a less productive culture. And then there was this kind of change. One of the explanations for kind of the rise of the European Enlightenment and the scientific revolution was basically the shift from alcohol all day to basically tea. And then coffee on the one hand, and then smoking when tobacco really took off. And so, basically everybody during the European Enlightenment was basically drinking caffeine and smoking tobacco like all day long.
Yeah, we got the best stuff. It's that was a very good period.
And then also there's some evidence, and it's hard to figure out, but some people point to the rise of obesity in Western societies is basically an exact inverse match to the graphs of the decline of smoking. So should companies have nicotine? Should companies have Zyn stations next to the Coke machine?
Well, I mean, based on what we know now, probably the only thing with these kinds of trends is the longitudinal studies are usually completed after it's too late to save all the people. So, I never, I don't think I'll do it. But it probably makes sense. Maybe we should do some self-experimenting first before we actually implement such a policy.
The other big news this week is apparently the weight loss, the semaglutide weight loss drugs like Ozempic, apparently they are causing pregnancies. So they're apparently causing possibly hormonal birth control to work less effectively, or they're just ramping up fertility. Or
ramping up
both.
fertility would be kind of positive in society because we have like a fertility crisis down.
Exactly, and then there's a question. This is like brand new research, and so I don't think they have it figured out yet. But then there's this question of like, okay, to the extent it is ramping up fertility, is it happening because it's actually doing something directly, or is it because actually more body fat actually lowers fertility? And so in other words, maybe it's a direct effect caused by the drug, or maybe it's a side effect of weight loss.
You're right. So maybe the whole fertility crisis is actually just the fat crisis, and then if you fix the fat crisis, you fix our other problems. That would be nice.
Yes.
Because it's all oh my God, the amount of hand wringing about everything from plastics to this to that, and maybe it's just people are too fat.
Yeah. Well, and you might hypothetically say, boy, if people are thinner, they might feel like having sex more often, and people might feel like having and maybe I don't know, maybe it's you can kind of squint, you can kind of paint a picture of like, okay, how about a nicotine and Ozempic fueled
That's a bright future.
Exactly.
Maybe that's better than weed and Percocets.
Exactly. Or, as I like to say, meth and Cheetos.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, we can leave that topic there.
We're going to get in trouble for some of these.
We're more than an hour in, so nobody's watching anymore anyway. So let's close on one. Actually, the question is a the question is a funny question, and I'm actually not sure if he intended it seriously, but it actually is a very interesting underlying question either way. So the question is, John Bind asks, how much of the backlash against remote work is investors concerned about the commercial real estate market versus actual productivity concerns? And I kind of like the idea. I would say I kind of like the reaction you're getting from Ben. Is I like the idea that investors are so Machiavellian that kind of we're collectively trying to somehow paper over the catastrophe in commercial real estate by forcing people to still work in the office. And I guess the good news is like that's not happening. And the reason that's not happening is just the investors.
I heard that come up actually. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the investors invest in commercial real estate are different than the investors that invest in companies, and so it's different people. So that's not literally happening. However, having said that, it does surface this very interesting question, which is, is the commercial real estate market is in this state of sort of I don't know, it's in this sort of it's a Schrodinger's cat kind of situation. Wile E. Coyote over the cliff. Yeah. So you have all of these buildings. In particular, you have a lot of buildings that were where the lease payments are now much, or the interest payments on the debt on the buildings is much higher than it was because of inflation. And so the landlords are in some level of financial distress. And then, companies that don't need as much commercial real estate because they're doing more remote work, they're going to start to let leases expire. And then you combine that with the issues we talked about last time, like crime in the city centers and so forth. And, and there are, this was a catalyst for some of the banking crises, a while back. And there's a lot of banks that in theory are in some trouble on this. And then there are cases where buildings are now changing hands for like pennies on the dollar because, right, so the way commercial real estate works basically is like if I buy a commercial real estate building, I buy it in part for equity and part for debt. If the price of the asset drops enough, or the interest payments get too high, at some point, they say turn the keys over to the bank. Just be like, fine, that building is bankrupt. You hand the building to the lender. The bank is then holding the building. The bank has no ability to run the building, doesn't want to own it, and so then they liquidate it, and the tenants have fallen out in the meantime, which really impairs the value of the building. And then the next buyer for the building says, great, I'll buy it for 20 cents on the dollar. And so you've got these assets where you've got this like basically massive, potential catastrophic crash in prices. This, by the way, this has all happened before. There have been, real estate goes through cycles, and so this does happen. So there's one scenario in which there's like a very big wipeout across the entire commercial real estate sector, and it takes down a whole bunch of, banks, and it's like a big thing. There's another version of this where no, actually people are still going to be mostly in the office 3 days a week. And if you're in 3 days versus 5 days, you still need the space, and, it's going to be fine, and the city still draw people. And then, there's another version of this where, there's like some, more complete reinvention of all the other topics we've been talking about, some complete reinvention of work, and companies are configured very differently. So anyway, let's maybe just touch on this as sort of the closing thing that we talk about. But what's our prognosis?
There's another crisis factor, which is real estate loans. Commercial real estate loans are typically made by regional banks in America.
Right.
And what we learned during the Silicon Valley bank run and the subsequent things is the federal government may or may not bail out regional banks. And so if you had, say, 500 of them all in crisis simultaneously, what would happen? And hopefully we don't have to answer that question, but it's certainly plausible. Now, I do think, one of the things we are seeing in at least office space is, the office space rents haven't dropped that much, at least in kind of San Francisco, New York, things like that. The mall space could be cataclysmic. And interestingly, I think that's it's also driven by COVID, but some combination of, the lockdowns causing online buying behavior, and then the lack of, or the new movement to enable theft up to a certain level and things like that. Plus whatever lacks or law enforcement, et cetera, lacks prosecution, has just caused these things to no longer be viable businesses. And so there's nothing to replace them with. And then you go, well, who's going to use that real estate? And that's a very big open question, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and actually, I'd even paint a grimmer picture on the. We learned during SVB. We learned not only is if a regional bank kind of hits this kind of crisis point like SVB did, and some other regional banks did, whatever that was a year and a half ago. The government may or may not bail them out, but the other thing we learned is the government may actually prevent them from being bailed out in the private market.
That was kind of diabolical what the FDIC did. Yeah.
So people who didn't track the SVB crisis carefully, there were other big banks that wanted to buy SVB, and there were private equity firms that wanted to buy SVB and basically do a private sector bailout requiring no taxpayer involvement, and the FDIC actually blocked those also, almost as if it was determined to have a catastrophe.
Yeah. The reasons were really weird. Like one of the blocks was there was a bank that was going to buy Silicon Valley Bank, and by buying Silicon Valley Bank, it would move up into the GSIB category, which is globally systemic important banks. And they're like, no more GSIBs. It's like, really? So you just let the bank die because you've got some principle that you don't want more GSIBs? They're all going to be GSIBs if you keep up this policy. That's obviously right. It's like the most craziest idea ever. And then, there were other ones where like it was a foreign bank or was it this or that. Yeah.
So the perverse
weird behavior. Yeah.
Yeah. So the perverse outcome from this is that after the 2008 financial crisis, there was this huge focus by reformers on what were called the too big to fail banks, right? Remember the whole book on the global financial crisis that Andrew Sorkin wrote was called Too Big to Fail. And the whole thing was we want to not have the companies, because if a bank is not systemically important, if the bank goes down the way a normal company goes down and it's fine and other competitors just pick up the slack, then there's no need for a bailout.
Yeah,
it's only when these banks get so large they become quote systemic, and then if they go down, they're going to take down the rest of the economy with them. And so the big conclusion everybody drew after 2008 was bailouts are bad, so to not have to do bailouts, you just can't have these banks be that big. So what they did was they put in place a legal regime called Dodd-Frank and a bunch of other regulations that had the result, sitting here 15 years later, of the too big to fail banks are now much larger than they were before. So the exact opposite of what
large, yeah.
Yes, gigantically, titanically large. And then On the small end, new bank charters in the U.S. have dropped basically to zero. So, and the reason is because Dodd-Frank, all these regulatory requirements, it's basically impossible to economically justify a new bank.
There was a bank that proposed a new charter where they were going to, they were not going to lend, they were going to use zero leverage. So no risk, basically. They were going to only take deposits and lend out money that they actually had, and at a ratio such that depositors won't lose their money. And, no hedge fund or that kind of activity, and it was denied. And the longest denial ever written. So it does seem like at least the current administration/administrative state is determined not to have new banks at a very extreme level.
Yep. And then to Ben's point, you have the other banks are these regional banks, the mid-sized banks, which are kind of local to cities. And the whole point of the regional banks is for sectors like real estate, where you want to actually have like a hands-on, you want your bank to actually be local, so they can be hands-on, like eyes on a real estate development project, where they actually know what's going on and they're aware of everything. And so the specific danger is that a broad-based wipeout in commercial real estate, catalyzed by all the other things that we've been talking about, would take down the regional banks. And if that happens, then basically, to Ben's point, the only banks that are left ultimately would be like the Big Ten, or maybe even the Big Three. And at that point, you've actually centralized the banking system to a far greater degree in the hands of a small number of players than was the case in 2008, which again is the exact opposite of what everybody said they wanted. And so it's for people who are into this kind of thing, the rabbit hole as to why that's the case and why we seem to be in this like mad rush to get to that result is a very interesting question.
Yeah. Yep. I'm not going to even comment on that because it would be a very long conspiracy theory answer.
Exactly. And so we will leave it there. So Benjamin, it is a pleasure as always. And thank you again, everybody on Twitter /X for all of the great questions. And we will be back soon.
All right. Thank you.